Hey, and welcome back, guys. This is session number 26 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. We're halfway there. Hopefully, this course has been a good course for you, edifying and encouraging. And as we continue into chapter number 7 here, we see Jesus in this text encounter a woman who is going to serve as an example of what Jesus had just talked about regarding defilement. So let's go ahead and jump right into the text. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. Yet he, Jesus, could not be hidden. So Mark says that Jesus went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Remember, one of our tools for interpreting a text, right? Anytime you see a location in a text, right, you should stop and determine where that location is and what might be important about that location. We discussed Tyre and Sidon in a session way a long time ago, right? In session number 9. Anything special that you remember about this particular region? Let me help you out a little bit. First, let's look at this trusty map here, right? So Tyre and Sidon is right up here along this coastline up here, right? About 50 miles northwest of Capernaum. Remember from our previous sessions why Tyre and Sidon is important. Well, first, because it is Gentile territory. It is not Jewish territory, right? It's Gentile. And it actually is the home, and we didn't talk about this last time, of one of the most infamous women in Scripture. Do you know who that is? I'll tell you. It's Jezebel, right? Jezebel was a figure in Scripture who gave the prophet Elijah a very hard time in 1 Kings, if you want to check it out. 1 Kings 16. In fact, she gave him such a hard time, it led Elijah into a deep depression. You should check it out sometime. It's an interesting account on self-awareness from Elijah's viewpoint and depression, a few things that we really don't talk about in the church very often, but it's really good to see that even a prophet thought about taking his life because of the persecution he was getting from this figure. But she's infamous for having stood up against Elijah and killing a lot of people in the Old Testament. So she's from this region of Tyre and Sidon. And that's going to be interesting because he's going to encounter another woman in this text from Tyre and Sidon. But it's not going to be a Jezebel type. It's going to be someone else as we look at it. And from there, he arose and went away to Tyre and Sidon, right? And then he entered a house. Now, this text says that Jesus went into a house. Interesting note now, Mark tends to reserve Jesus's divine revelations for houses in his text, right? So whenever a scene occurs in a house, you as the reader can just assume in Mark's gospel that some divine revelation or act is about to happen, right? Remember when the men were actually lowered through the roof of the house to see Jesus, that paralytic men, the men lowered their friend to the house, right? And also remember when in our last session, Jesus gives the disciples a deeper understanding of his comments to the Pharisees about the defilement. It actually happens in a house, if you remember seeing that in the text. So whenever Jesus enters a house in Mark's gospel, you can almost always bet that something is about to go down, right? So Mark has been setting his reader up in this text for something this whole time. Remember, he's writing to a Gentile audience as his audience for this gospel. Now Jesus enters Tyre and Sidon, right? A Gentile territory, right after he discusses uncleanliness, right? Which many Gentiles were considered unclean. So Mark is setting up something in this text. Now he's about to actually rock his readers' minds here in this text because something's about to happen with a woman who is a Gentile. But here's the other thing. Jesus didn't want anyone to know. And the text says that he could not be hidden, right? He didn't want anyone to know that he was in Gentile territory. Why? Well, I think part of it is because he was sure that the Pharisees wouldn't follow him over there. Why? Because they were concerned about becoming unclean. So they weren't going to come over to Gentile territory. He thought he was going to be safe, be able to relax, right? He thought he was going to be able to get some rest. Again, this text right here reveals what we call the Markan secret, right? We've been discussing that secret throughout this course. Jesus trying to remain incognito, trying to remain secret, yet the text says he could not be hidden, even in Gentile territory. Look at what happens. Look at why he could not be hidden. Immediately, our word again, right? Euthos. Immediately, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. She came and fell down at his feet. Now, do you remember the last person who came and fell down at Jesus's feet in this gospel? It happens in Mark chapter 5, right? And that's our man Jairus, whose daughter was sick, right? He came asking for healing for his daughter. So this falling down at one's feet, we already discussed this, is a posture of worship and submission. So this woman, who's a Gentile, is at her wit's end. She is done, like Jairus, right? Like Jairus, this healing was for her child. So she'll stop at nothing to have her healed and whole, even coming and falling down at this man's feet, who is a Jewish person, who Gentiles usually didn't deal with, right? Now, the woman was a Gentile, Mark tells us, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, let's look at this part of the text here. We both find out that she's a Gentile and a Syrophoenician. We learn some very important details about her here. So she has two things in this text that are working against her culturally, right? She's a woman, right? In this culture, men usually dominated women. And rabbis like Jesus weren't even supposed to have direct contact with women. So she's also a Gentile, right? As a Syrophoenician. And the Gentiles actually hated the Jews. We know that, right? And Jews hated Gentiles. And in many instances, Gentiles actually ruled over Jews because the Roman government was in power, right? So they were unkind and dominant when it came to Jewish people. But this woman, who has two strikes against her, right? She's a woman and she's a Gentile culturally. When you look at it from a Jewish perspective, asks something you'd never think a Gentile would ask a Jew. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Begged him. And you would think Jesus would be nice, right? Look at what happens, though. He goes on to say this, right? And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Whoa! That takes me back a little bit, right? I'm taken aback by those words. Why are you calling this woman a dog? What's going on, Jesus? What's happening? Is Jesus being rude here? Well, let's start with the beginning of this text so we can get the literary and cultural context of what's happening here. Now, literary context merely just means, hey, what happened before this? What happened after this, right? Well, Jesus had just told the Pharisees look, guys, you're so concerned about what's come in contact with Gentiles that you missed the whole point. It's not the outside that matters, right? We talked about that in our last session. It's the heart. So Jesus here, although he is affirming his personal mission to actually go to the Gentiles first, right? He had foreshadowed in the previous text when he talks about the inside being clean and talks about it being a heart issue, including Gentile people with those words that he spoke to the Pharisees, right? So now Mark is going to prove what Jesus said in this text, right? He's going to prove that Jesus is saying, hey, it is a heart matter because this woman is about to be somebody who's included, who's actually someone who is an outsider, quote unquote. But again, it's a heart issue for Jesus, right? And then second, let's take a look at the cultural context and figure out why Jesus's words aren't as heartless as they look, right? Jesus himself mentions in the gospel that his personal mission was to the lost house of Israel, right? And that's in Matthew 15:24. Now, the word first here is important, right? Because it's not an exclusive statement from Jesus that he's making here. It's actually one of order. So first, he is called to the Jewish people. That was Jesus's personal mission, was to the Jewish people. Paul uses this, right, in Romans 1:16, where he talks about the power of God, the gospel being the power of God for salvation for the Jews first, and then the Gentiles. So there's an order to the gospel being revealed. The book of Acts has that order, right? Jesus talks about proclaiming the gospel to Judea, Samaria, and to all the earth, right? So there's an order to it. It goes to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles, right? So the children, who the Israelites, need to be fed, quote unquote, first. Now, why is that? Why do they need to be fed first? Well, that word for is a great word. It's a connecting word. It always connects it with the previous text. It tells you the reason for the previous statement. Why do the children need to be fed first? It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, here's some cultural context you need to know. Worthless food in Jewish culture was thrown to dogs, right? If you look at Exodus 22:31, it says that you shall be consecrated to me. Therefore, you should not eat any flesh that is torn by beast in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. Now, let's be honest here. This statement is very tough to read, right? Don't take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Well, yes, but not the way you might think. In this culture, there are two types of dogs, right? Scavengers, who are walking around the street of Palestine. These were seen as deplorable creatures by all of the first century people, Jewish and Gentiles alike. But the Greek word that Jesus used here for the word dogs isn't a reference to those kind of dogs, not scavengers. He uses, this is your first Greek word for this session, kainarion, which is used in the New Testament period to actually refer to domesticated dogs. So they had house dogs. Not Jews. Gentiles had house dogs, right? So these kind of dogs or animals were found in the wealthy homes in Greek culture. So this woman, remember, she's a Syrophoenician Greek. So Jesus is speaking her language, so to speak. She knows about these kainarions, these domesticated dogs. She knows all about them and the affinity that the owners have for them, right? It's like the dogs in our day. People love their dogs, right? So on top of that, though, children had a privileged positions in these homes that had these dogs. And the dogs that Jesus mentions here have this less privileged position. So there's privilege there, but it's less privileged than the children in the household. Most dog owners today would tell you that, right? So here's the key, though. The dogs they're going to have their turn. They're always going to have their turn. So the analogy that Jesus uses here merely speaks of what theologians call Jesus's missional priority. He had a priority for his own mission. His personal ministry was focused on the Jewish context. And his disciples who were going to follow him had a mission and ministry that was going to focus on the Gentile context. But we always see little instances in the Gospels where Jesus encounters Gentiles and still shares these moments with them that serve as kind of a precursor for the gospel reaching the nations. So this is one of those instances with this Greek woman, as is the account right after this where Jesus heals a man who is deaf in Gentile territory. Now, this woman could have accepted Jesus's answer and walked away, right? She could have said, typical Jewish guy. I knew he'd say that, right? But what did she say? What did she say here? She answered him and said, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." What a comeback, right? What a clapback from this woman, right? She said, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Wait, Jesus, I know these domesticated dogs you talk about, she's thinking. And I know one thing. I know that the owner loves these domesticated dogs and cares for them. So even the dogs eat the children's crumbs. That's how we know that this statement isn't offensive to this woman, because she calls her own daughter a dog here. She calls her a domesticated dog. And she does something interesting with Jesus's words that you need to carefully read the Greek to understand. But we're going to talk about it here because that's what this course is all about, right? The word children Jesus uses here means biological children. He used biological children in the previous verse. The word children that she uses here is another word. It's actually an inclusive term. It includes biological children and servants in the house. So as long as someone was in the house, they were considered children. Theologically, this is a huge statement from this woman. She changes his words and actually is a precursor of the gospel going to the nations. People who are servants in the house are still considered grafted in. That's what Paul talks about in his writings about the Gentiles being grafted into the family of God in Romans, right? This woman's changes one word and makes a statement about the mercy of God extending beyond biological Israel by using the inclusive word for children here. Now, there are two things I think here that demonstrate this woman's level of faith. One, she calls Jesus Lord. In that culture, people use the term to say someone who is socially superior. For a Gentile to admit this of a Jew would have made Mark's readers or Gentiles kind of scratch their heads, right? Wait, a Gentile's calling a Jew superior here, calling him Lord? So in a sense, she was at least calling him socially superior, even if she didn't understand that the salvation found in that term Lord, right? And then the other thing that she does to show her great level of faith, she uses this word crumbs. I love this. Okay. So in this text, she recognizes how little of Jesus's power is needed to actually heal her daughter. She says, "Look, Jesus, I know that children get priority, but I also know your power. And all I need is just a little bit of it in order for my daughter to be healed. I just need crumbs." That's the faith that this woman had in this text. She didn't even need a full meal because she knew how much power was vested in Jesus. This is amazing. It's good to see that this woman who's a Gentile actually gets this parable that Jesus is talking about. And she decides to actually use the parable in order for Jesus to empower her daughter to be healed, to have that power that she's talking about here and articulate it in terms of crumbs. Like even just a little bit of your power, Jesus, is actually all I need because I know that you are all powerful. It's a powerful statement from this woman. No pun intended, actually. So he said to her, "For this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." Now, Matthew, in his account, writes that Jesus says, "Woman, you have great faith." Think about that. Jesus has been walking around with these disciples, trying to get them to get it for so long, right? And then this Gentile comes along and gets it with 1 to 2 sentences that she says. She enters Jesus's parable about tables and dogs and uses it to actually declare her faith. While everybody else is missing out on the meaning of Jesus's parable, she gets it. This would have been super encouraging for Mark's Gentile readers, right? Imagine them reading that and saying, "Oh my goodness, a Gentile got it in this text. All these Jewish folks have been missing it, but this person who is just like us actually gets it." And Jesus says that she has great faith. and tells her to go her way and that the demon has left her daughter. Amazing. And then look at what happens. She went home, found the child laying in the bed, and the demon was gone. One final comparison here. If you look at 1 Kings 17, we're going to return to our friend Elijah, right? Because in that text, there's another Phoenician woman who asked Elijah to receive healing for her son. Now, we know Mark, again, is writing to a Gentile audience, but a Jewish reader would certainly make the connection with what Elijah did for the woman in 1 Kings and what Jesus does for this woman in this text. Mark is saying, in so many words, Jesus is operating in his role as one greater than Elijah. And ultimately, as Elijah raised this woman's child up, Jesus himself will raise up all who have faith in him in the resurrection. Mark is making that resurrection connection with Elijah on a much grander scale here by saying that, hey, here's another Phoenician woman that Jesus encounters in this text. And he's not just going to raise up this woman's son. He's actually going to raise everyone at the end of the age. And that is the gospel. So the main idea of this text, okay, if unclean foods like pigs and dogs were no longer unclean, neither were the Gentiles. Mark includes this because he knows his Gentile readers need to hear this, need to see this story, need to see the picture that Jesus paints here. So here's the point of application for me and for you. We need to constantly check ourselves for biases that would lead us to declare certain people in our culture unclean or too far from God. Whether it be that politician that we can't stand, or a non-Christian who has wronged us personally, or a Christian who has wronged us. We have to believe and pray that Jesus has the ability, as we see in this text, to make the unclean clean. And remember, it only takes a crumb of Jesus' power to change a person's life. That's how powerful and sovereign he is. So in those moments when I'm discouraged by a person's actions, I remember that an all-powerful God can change a person in an instant. And all it takes is a crumb from the master's table. You know, Dwight Moody is reported to have said that Jesus sent no one away empty except those who were full of themselves. May you and I come to Jesus the same way that this woman did, not full of ourselves, but emptied of our ego and our pride, especially when it comes to declaring certain things unclean or too far from Jesus, because we ourselves one day were too far from him. And he drew us near by the power of the gospel, by the power of the cross. May we never feel like anyone else is too far from the grace of God. All right, folks, that's been session number 26. Wow. We are all done with half of our course. Cannot wait for the second half. Next go around, we'll jump into session number 27. Can't wait. Grace and peace.